Okay, they tell me that we are already 54. We know there are many more coming, but maybe I can start with my introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody, good night, if there is somebody in the Far East. And so this is our second Coastal Resilience webinar. It is a joint webinar series with the Euro-Mediterranean Center for Climate Change and the UN Decade Collaborative Center for Coastal Resilience. They're both in Italy, one in Bologna and the center in Lecce. So we do normally our webinars on Tuesdays. In these webinars, we try to explore case studies, research, and we try to put in touch people from the UN Decade with experts that are actually on a wider scope or people that work inside the UN Decade and want to get in touch with a larger community. So let's see. Yeah, we go backward. Sorry, just go back. Yeah, so the United Nations of Ocean Science, thank you. Of Ocean Science is has started in 2021 and will end in 2030, maybe even a bit later. And it is divided into decade challenges and decade outcomes. Our webinar series contributes greatly to the increase of community resilience to ocean and coastal risks. So meaning greatly means mainly, hopefully greatly, but we say mainly first. And decade outcomes, a safe ocean. And we are one of the centers that contribute to the coordination of the activities of 47 programs, 300 projects, contributions, and activities. Yeah, so here you find two important QR codes, which I hope you can, in the few minutes that I'm gonna stay here, scan, and so that you can connect with us and the rest of our activities in addition to webinars. So we have on the one side the Decade Center for Coastal Resilience, and I would advise you to join the community of practice, which we are going to try to animate more in the months to come. We have a DCC newsletter, and then you have the center where we have a newsletter also, and the CMCC website where you can subscribe. Today, it is my pleasure to have Dr. Susan Bates talking about an important program that Nature Conservancy has sponsored and will sponsor. Susan here is a PhD in climate dynamics from George Mason University. And my own way to present her is that she does the work of the future. Her role includes collaborating with partners to create tools and strategies that guide coastal resilience, decision, and showcasing decisions and projects, the benefits of nature-based solutions, and fostering strong community connections. This is a very important job and a new job for our field. Somebody of her knowledge and competence in science devotes herself to having this science to be useful and to be, I would say, useful for coastal resilience. Another focus of her research is on nature-based solutions, which are important solutions for resilience. So we will hear her soon. And a few informations here on how the session is going to run. We are not allowing any voice communication, but we ask you to use the Q&A session in Zoom to write your questions, and then we will pose the questions to Susan at the end of her speech. Now, the session is also, we'd like to remind you that the session is also recorded. And thank you again for joining us. The next webinar will be December 10th by Professor Anna Queiroz, Marine Climate Change Ecologist at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. And now I rapidly get out of this and I leave the floor to Susan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nadia. Let me get my screen up. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone on the call. Are you seeing my presentation?
Yes, we see.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for attending this webinar and for being interested in coastal resilience at the Nature Conservancy. And thank you very much to the organizers and to Nadia and Annalisa for all the work they've done inviting me and getting me on this webinar. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Nadia mentioned, that I am kind of a connector between the science and then the work on the ground. And that's really why I joined the Nature Conservancy, was to be able to bridge that gap and have the science and research that's done be useful to on the ground projects. So the Nature Conservancy's mission statement is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And in the Coastal Resilience Program, we want to help communities and habitat be less vulnerable to sea level rise, and we want to use nature-based solutions wherever possible to decrease that vulnerability. So I lead the Coastal Resilience Program in Virginia, and the landscape where I work is called the Virginia Coast Reserve. So in this talk, I'll describe how we've implemented the Nature Conservancy's Coastal Resilience Program in our landscape in Virginia. I'm going to highlight the Nature Conservancy's online coastal resilience tool, which is a means by which we get that research into something that can be used to make decisions either about restoration or decisions about resilience. And I'll show how it's been used for specific projects. And I'll also highlight as we go along the ways that we engage our community here on the Eastern Shore. And you'll see that we have a unique situation with both long-term research that has made a lot of this possible and long-term community relationships. And what I hope to give you today is a sense for how important it is to have community engagement at every step of a project, and that it's important to connect with entities that already have those community relationships. And hopefully you'll also come away with some ideas that you might be able to implement in your own work. All right, so if my slide will advance. Is it advancing for you all? There we go. This will just give you an idea of where I am in the world and the landscape that I'm talking about. So we're zooming in on the east coast of the US. And Brownsville Preserve is the location where the Virginia Coast Reserve office is. And so we are located here on this approximate 70-mile stretch of peninsula. It's the southern end of a peninsula called the Delmarva Peninsula. We have the Chesapeake Bay to our west and the Atlantic Ocean to our east. And you can see we have a series of barrier islands along the coast and extensive coastal bays behind those. And this is the landscape that we call the Virginia Coast Reserve. This is a very rural area. We have approximately 55,000 people that live in two counties on the Virginia portion of this peninsula. We have 19 incorporated towns, and we have many towns located on what we call the seaside and also the bay side that are vulnerable to flooding and storm surge. And these barrier islands actually did have a couple of communities on them many years ago. And in the early 30s, there was an unnamed storm that actually kind of did them in, and they decided as a community to move. And so many of the homes and churches were barged over across the coastal bays to locations on the mainland. And so the communities I'll be talking about with you today are not on these barrier islands. This whole system is now allowed to operate in a sort of natural way. And so the communities I'll be talking about are either on what we call the seaside side of the peninsula or the bay side. And here's a map that shows all of the conserved lands on the eastern shore of Virginia. So every color is showing you a location of a conserved property. The green is owned by the Nature Conservancy. There are 133 total acres of conserved and protected lands. About 40,000 of those are owned or managed by the Nature Conservancy, and the remainder are owned or managed by our federal, state, and local partners. And so you see that the majority of the barrier islands are conserved lands, and as I mentioned, they're allowed to do what they need to do. We don't have structures in the way. They're allowed to operate naturally. And so, because of this, this is the largest expanse of coastal wilderness on the East Coast. I don't know why this isn't moving when I hit the button. There we go. So because of that, because this is a naturally operating system, we call the Virginia Coast Reserve a living laboratory. And this means that, oops, it's an ideal setting in which to conduct research, specifically to study and demonstrate the ability of nature-based solutions to mitigate risk from rising sea levels and extreme storms, for impact to habitat, both marine and avian, as well as resilience for coastal communities. And what we learn here can be exported to other coastal communities around the world. So sorry, I'm at home and my screens are set up differently, so I'm having a little trouble navigating the buttons. So the Coastal Resilience Program in the Nature Conservancy is a global network of practitioners who are applying an approach and a web-based mapping tool designed to help communities understand their vulnerability from coastal hazards, to reduce their risk and determine the value of nature-based solutions. And our implementation here in Virginia is kind of based on these three aspects. We have the Coastal Resilience Online Mapping Tool, which you can see an example map of the Eastern Shore with flooding. I don't remember what year that is, but flooding in the future. And then we also demonstrate nature-based solutions, which means that we put things out in the environment, but then we also research the value and the effectiveness of those nature-based solutions. And each of these three feed into one another. So we use the coastal resilience tool to figure out the best places for some of these nature-based solutions. And then the research that's done on them, the hope is that we can take that research and put it back into the tool to help inform future projects. So the tool currently has 5 applications. There's a flood and sea level rise, and we call them apps for applications. Flood and sea level rise app, a future habitat app, a coastline change, and a living shoreline app. And then we also have layers called regional planning, which has socioeconomic information and also information about where emergency management infrastructure is located. And I want to point out that community engagement and outreach runs throughout all of these processes. So I'm going to describe these activities within the Virginia Coast Reserve to you, not, by going step by step through the tool and showing you what it does, but really show you how we have used it for specific projects. So first of all, if you go to this website at the top, coastalresilience.org, you'll come up with this map. Actually, I think it should be maps.coastalresilience.org. And oh, that's down here at the bottom. You'll see this global map, and this is actually the global coastal resilience tool. And each area in blue is where the coastal resilience tool has been adapted for use in that particular location. And each one is modified in a way that fits the specific location. So if you go to each one, you're not necessarily going to see the same apps or the information maybe in displayed in the same way. So the Coastal Resilience Tool at the Virginia Coast Reserve was first, or work on it first started around 2014. And on the left here, you see a plot. When you open up the tool, you'll see a map of the Eastern Shore. And here we've got projected water depth in the year 2100 displayed, just as an example. Also, you can see the red dots and other dots on there, and this is that community planning or regional planning layer where you can look to see where the schools are, where your fire and rescue stations are, to get an idea, or also vulnerable populations, to get an idea of how flooding might impact those facilities. What you're looking at on the right are some sessions that we had with the community in 2014, 2015, to really find out what the community needed from a coastal resilience tool. And you can see people giving input in these pictures. And one of the reasons that we're even able to have this tool is because of our long-term relationships with academic partners. And specifically, the Long-Term Ecological Research Project through the University of Virginia has a facility in a town called Oyster, and also the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences has a facility in Wachaprague. And they have been collecting data in these coastal bays for decades. And that's really it's the data that allowed us to create this tool in the first place. And then we continued getting community input and creating more apps through about 2019. We've also conducted sessions to teach people how to use this tool, and we continue to check in with our communities to make sure that the tool is providing what they need, and if there's anything else that they would like to see displayed on it. And so I'm going to go through and show you plots from this tool that helped us to either assess certain communities, plan activities, and even apply for funding, which is what I use it for quite a bit. Before I do that, I also want to mention that as part of our Coastal Resilience Program in Virginia, um, within our chapter, we created a team called the Coastal Adaptation and Resilience Team, and it's made up of the practitioners or scientists who do the work and also our government relations staff. And our goal is to ensure that all Virginia communities are represented in statewide planning efforts and have the funding opportunities. And so what that means is we review a lot of documents, and in some cases we have a seat at the table to help shape the planning efforts. And really we want to make sure that our rural communities, because a lot of times the rural communities who aren't the big population centers don't get the attention, and we want to make sure that those are represented in these plans for funding or planning efforts in general. So we've been building relationships and been a part of our community for more than 50 years. And because we live here and will continue to live here, that gives us a unique relationship with the place that we protect. And therefore, we want to make sure that we're communicating authentically with our community. So a few years ago, the Virginia Coast Reserve created an advisory panel, and it's made up of different sectors on the Eastern Shore community. So we have a large farming population. There's aquaculture that happens here. We have a healthcare community, churches and religious groups, and different cultures. And so we rotate the members of the advisory panel and try to have people from each of those sectors represented. We also have education and outreach programs. So every fifth, seventh, and 10th grader in public school spends a day at Brownsville Preserve or on a boat learning from our education staff. And then wherever possible, we use volunteers to do the work, to do the on-ground work. And I'm going to show examples of all of this throughout the talk. And then I just wanted to point out this one last thing. You'll love our nature. So this is the motto for the Eastern Shore of Virginia. When you cross over the Bay Bridge Tunnel from the Virginia Beach, Norfolk area, there's a sign that welcomes you to the Eastern Shore, and under it, it says, "You'll love our nature." And so as the Nature Conservancy, we want to ensure that the nature we enjoy here and that this community enjoys remains into the future, along with the access that's needed by the community members and what it provides economically to the local communities. So here's the map of the Eastern Shore again, and I've pointed out 3 different communities. And I'm going to use the projects that we have here as examples of how we use the tool and community engagement in these areas. So we have Oyster, which is a small community here in the southern part of the peninsula, Wachapreague, and then we have Saxis, which is up here near the border with Maryland and is kind of this little almost an island. It is connected by marsh, but you have to drive across a long causeway across this marsh to get to the island of Saxis. So starting off in Oyster, this is a picture that may look familiar to many of you if you work in coastal communities. This is not storm flooding. This is from sunny day, high tide flooding. Right here where this flooding is, that's a road, one of the main accesses into the south side of Oyster Harbor, and then here is the neighborhood road here. So along with partners at Northampton County, which is the county in which Oyster is located, we were able to get funding to help this community write an adaptation and resilience plan. And so, like many coastal communities on the Eastern Shore, Oyster provides a lot of resources to the entire Eastern Shore community. So it's a community that's important to the folks that live there, but also important to people who need access to the water, either through the public boat ramp. This is what we call the working waterfront, where commercial fishermen, aquaculture folks use docks. We have aquaculture facilities. The Nature Conservancy has a facility. There's also a research center located here. So lots of important community resources. And the Nature Conservancy has been engaging with this community for a few years and have continued to do so through this process. So first, though, in order to get the funding, we used the Nature Conservancy's Coastal Resilience Tool to assess what was happening in Oyster. And so this comes from the Coastline Change app. And in this app, you can plot the locations of the front side of the barrier islands in different years. You can also have it do a movie to show you how the barrier islands have shifted and changed over time. Some of the islands we have data back into the 1850s, and so it's aerial images that were digitized to show the location of the islands. And so here we have 2 islands with Sandshell Inlet in the middle. The purple line is from 1911. The yellow line is 2013, and the pink line is from 2004. And so what we notice here is that this inlet has been getting wider and also shifting to the south. And that is making it line up more with Sandshell Channel, which you can see leads directly into the community of Oyster. So a lot more energy is coming that way. And that's making it more important for these marsh islands to protect that town. So instead of having barrier islands that are sort of the first line of defense against storm and sea level rise, the community is now relying more on these marsh islands. And in fact, well, I'll mention it a little bit later, but we now have a project to try to help bolster these marshes right here to help increase resilience for the community. So now moving to the flood and sea level rise app, these are plots that we used in a proposal to show the vulnerability of Oyster. On the left, it's showing you the water depth in 2050, and this is just the mean sea level in 2050, not storm surge. And then this is the projected water depth in 2100. And so you can see that by 2100, pretty much the entire community of Oyster, the public boat ramp, are underwater. And from this tributary, even one of our main thoroughfares here on the Eastern Shore called Seaside Road becomes flooded in a portion of it. And then if we plot storm surge, this is actually present day storm surge due to a high intensity storm. And this plot is showing the water depths from that. And I put the satellite image of Oyster up here again just to orient you, because really this entire area of Oyster could be underwater due to one of these storms. And this Seaside Road, as you can see, really gets flooded in this scenario as well. And then to think about nature-based solutions and what might be able to help and protect this community, we can turn to the Future Habitat app and also the Living Shoreline app. And so what you're looking at in this plot is the living shoreline suitability of the marshes off of Oyster. So this is Oyster Harbor right here. And the green is showing you locations where marsh enhancement could help the marshes be more stable and be more resilient into the future. Orange is generally a location that experiences more energy, and just marsh enhancement isn't going to necessarily keep that shoreline stable. And so you may have to put structures such as riprap or something to help break the energy of those waves. And then we can also look at the Future Habitat app. And as part of that app, we have what's called a Marsh Vulnerability Index. And that looks at different stressors to the marsh, to erosion. So for example, waves, boat wake, the elevation of the marsh, the shape of the marsh, vegetation characteristics, sea level rise, and storm surge intensity. And it plots what the vulnerability is to each of those stressors. And you can plot them individually or as one whole vulnerability index. And so I just picked one that puts these marshes at high risk, which is vegetation height. These marshes are also vulnerable to storm surge and wave exposure. And so again, I mentioned these marsh islands where we now have funding to do some restoration. We used these plots as evidence for that these marshes are good candidates for that type of activity. As part of, oops, you weren't supposed to be seeing that whole picture. So I have some important stuff covered up, but I'll tell you what it is. So with this funding, when we first received the funding, we put together what we call a resilient steering committee in the community of Oyster. And we actually talked with community members about who should be on that committee. And we wanted all of the sectors of stakeholders within Oyster to be represented. And the community helped us figure out who those people should be. And so we have local government, so you know, board of supervisors. I don't know if there's anything like that in the countries where all of you are, but like our local planners in the county and our planning district commissions have representation here. We have state partner, our Virginia Marine Resources Commission has a member who sits on here. We have community members that sit on this committee. And then also the Nature Conservancy is a community member. We own a lot of property in and around Oyster that can be used to help bolster their resilience. And so one thing that we did is we wrote into our grant some learning opportunities for us and for the Resilient Steering Committee. And so this is a picture of some of our staff and also some of the Resilient Steering Committee members getting a tour of a neighborhood in Norfolk, Virginia. This gentleman is the project lead for that project, and he was explaining the process and the different strategies that they came up with. And they're walking along an earthen berm that was implemented for this neighborhood. Okay, so when we were looking for a consultant to lead us through this process and to write the plan, we sort of defined these four things as what we wanted to come out of an adaptation and resilience plan. And we worked with the Resilience Steering Committee to define these activities. And so we wanted the plan to define the community assets at risk, to assess the risk and the vulnerability of those assets, and then to prioritize projects for both the near term and also the long term. And then we wanted the community to prioritize, oops, sorry about that, to prioritize about 5 projects. And then we wanted the engineering firm to do 10% design plans. And the reason for this is we wanted the community to have a plan that when a funding opportunity came along, they could pull one of these projects out that was appropriate for that funding opportunity and then apply for that funding. And so this is the process that the consulting company went through. The company that we hired was Dewberry. And in fact, the Resilience Steering Committee read through all the proposals, and they're the ones who chose the firm to do this work. And so as you can see, it's not the Nature Conservancy leading this process. We're facilitating it, but it's the community and this Resilience Steering Committee that are leading the process. And so this was the timeline that Dewberry followed and the activities that they did. And on the bottom, it's showing the point at which we had a Resilience Steering Committee meeting in order to get input on the process. And then on the top, we have some of the activities that the consulting company did, like the flood hazard mapping or the vulnerability assessment. But we've also pointed out when we had public open houses. And this is when we invited everyone in the community, or anyone who had interest in the community, to come and give their input at different stages in this process. And so we also would always have a Resilience Steering Committee before a public open house. And the reason for this was really to socialize what Dewberry was going to present at the open house and just get input on how should we do that, how do we present this information in the best way for the community. And then I'm just zooming in on some of these pictures of the open houses, and just to point out that we had 4 open houses, and the topics at them were: the first one, we wanted to get input on the challenges and the types of strategies that the community prefers, so gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure, what they wanted their community to look like in the future. The second open house, we focused on the summary of risk analysis that Dewberry completed, and examples of specific strategies that the community could then vote for. So, for example, relocating a road that gets flooded, implementing nature-based solution of living breakwaters and an earthen berm, all the way to a gray infrastructure solution of putting a tide gate at the mouth of the harbor. And people got to vote for the strategies that they preferred. The third open house, we reviewed the initial designs from the engineering company for the 5 projects that were prioritized at the second open house. And then the fourth open house was actually just yesterday, and we were getting input on the final designs and on the draft plan. And because of time, I'm actually going to skip over this, but these are the prioritized projects. And I just want to point out that these are the near-term strategies and the ones that they have 10% design on. But the plan also does address long-term. So these short-term strategies are effective and were designed to be effective until about mid-century, and for a medium intensity storm. And so these are not going to keep the community resilient toward the end of the century. And so there is discussion of needing to move structures towards the end of the century in this plan. So using Oyster as an example, and as a blueprint, really, what we took, or we took what we had done in oyster, the proposal and the whole process, and we're now implementing it in the community of Saxis on our western side of the peninsula on the bay side. And as you can see, Saxis also deals with sunny day flooding. The picture on the right is actually showing you that causeway I mentioned that goes across the marsh. You can see the guardrails on the sides of this road that get flooded. So this community already uh, times their trips on and off the island based on the tides. And another reason I wanted to show you this project is because we use the coastal resilience tool in a different way in our proposal to show the vulnerability. And one reason is there's a lot of protected land up in this area, and there's a lot of the land that in the marsh system that are used by a specific bird, the salt marsh sparrow. And so we want to make sure that the habitat in this area is able to remain resilient and maintain that habitat into the future. And so what you're looking at here is a plot of the habitats that are present right now under current conditions. And this is that kind of island of Saxis with the extensive marsh behind it. And here you can see the access road, that causeway that goes into the town. And so the orange is irregularly flooded salt marsh. The green is regularly flooded. We have a little bit of beach area, freshwater, tidal wetlands in here. And what the tool allows you to do is to draw a polygon anywhere and then determine how the habitat areas are going to change into the future. And so for the next slide, I drew a polygon just around this area of Saxis, so just for the town. And I put this table here because it identifies what the different colors are. And so if you look at 2030, what the table is going to show you is the total acres of each land category in 2030, and then it's going to tell you how it changed from present day. So in this case, developed dry land lost 41 acres by 2030. And then you also get a percent change of that habitat. And I did this for 2030, 2050, and 2075. And each time it's compared to the present day conditions. And so we can really see those changes in habitats. In the earlier years, we have irregularly flooded salt marsh. Oh, I should have mentioned also, this line here is kind of the zero line, and anything on the left is a loss of land area, and anything on the right is a gain of land area. And so we're losing irregularly flooded marsh and gaining regularly flooded marsh. But towards the end of the century in 2075, we aren't gaining regularly flooded marsh. We're actually getting open water. We're also gaining some tidal flats and flooded developed dry land. And so this plot was actually used in our proposal in order to show the vulnerability of the habitat in this area. And so now I want to move to the last project I'm going to highlight, which is off the town of Wachapreague. And you're looking at a picture here of that community here on the seaside. And you can see that it is open to this large bay. And then the barrier islands are out here in the Atlantic Ocean. And so the inlet here is also widening and making the town more susceptible to the energy coming from the open ocean. And so it makes, again, as we've learned, these marsh islands even more important. And so we have a project that was funded through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and in collaboration with the University of Virginia to do marsh restoration on this little marsh island that you can see here. And in this project, it was extremely impactful because we used about 2,500 volunteer hours to build the oyster reef. So the project is to put substrate down, which is a material that oysters will attach to grow an oyster reef. And then that oyster reef along the eroding edge of the marsh system actually knocks the energy out of the waves so that there's not as much erosion. That's the theory. And so we're putting this in, and our partners at the University of Virginia have been studying this to see the effectiveness of it. And so here you can see we have volunteers that are helping unload our cement block and build these what we call oyster castles. And here they are putting them in place. And then we even have folks back at Brownsville Preserve at our shop creating some of the substrate material. So we use volunteers at every step of this project. And a lot of them were new volunteers to the Nature Conservancy, and they are from this town. And so it really gave them an ownership over the project and understanding of what's happening out here. And as you can see from these pictures, this is the town of Wachapreague in the background. So you can really see how this marsh protects that community. So I just wanted to show you that it is working to capture oysters or have oysters land on them and grow. So the picture on the left is from shortly after installation of these oyster castle substrate. And on the right, I actually just took this picture on Saturday because we took a group out there to see it. So 1 to 2 years post installation, you can see all the oysters growing on these reefs. And again, you can see the town in the background. And so I mentioned that the University of Virginia is doing research on this marsh. And there was a graduate student, Libby Bieri, who's actually now one of our staff members, but she used this project as her master's thesis. And so on the right is a picture that shows you what I was mentioning. It shows you physically how, and this was before oysters had started growing, but it shows you how these structures knock the energy out of the waves so that the energy doesn't reach this shoreline and can help to slow erosion of this marsh face. And on the left is her science. So this is the plots and the research that show statistical significance. And what you're seeing, she measured the wave height out here outside of the structures and also inside of the structures. And so outside of the structures is in blue, and inside of the structures is in green. And so what we want to see is that inside the structures, the green is lower than the blue, showing that it's knocked the energy out of the waves. And in the deep water and in the intermediate water, that's not the case. And that's because the waves can go over those. But in the shallow areas, it's extremely effective. And the other thing that we hope that these castles or structures do is that even when the water is higher, so let's say a storm surge comes in the deep end, or actually even in the shallow areas, these structures aren't really going to impact those waves because the water is going to be a lot deeper. But when that water starts to recede, we hope that these structures help to catch some of that sediment that might otherwise wash off of that shoreline. So Libby also looked at how effective these structures were at slowing down erosion. And so she put these poles in. On the left-hand side, you'll see 2 different poles, one in a location that did not have an oyster reef off of it, and the bottom in a location where there was an oyster reef. And she took these photos in June and then went back in October and measured what had happened. And the plot on the left just shows you the data, but on the right, you can just see it by eye that the location that did not have a reef had much more erosion than the location that did have a reef. And this is just, we also tested the substrate material. And so Libby went and looked at the density of oysters on 2 different structures. So these castles weren't appropriate for the whole marsh edge. And I won't go into the details here, but we used this other substrate that we could mold into different shapes. And so she tested which one was more effective. And the red is actually this table-shaped structure, and it had higher oyster densities than the castles did. So this is information that we can help to help us plan for other projects. And in addition to having volunteers on this project, we also had events in a local restaurant there, and you can actually see the marsh from the windows of the restaurant, which is pretty unique for our projects. And we even had boats available, and we're taking folks out to see the project. We also took the town council, this is the Wachapreague Town Council, out to see the project. And then this was from this past Saturday, the top right. We took the town council from Saxis. And so we're really trying to use our projects and show other communities how projects are working in other places and give them an idea of how they might implement them in their location as well. So I will wrap up here. So with the coastal resilience tool, I'm always looking to improve upon the information in the tool. And we have projects going on that we're hoping to get data that can then inform more of our projects on the ground to help make communities and habitats less vulnerable. And with each of our projects, I think you've seen that we build on our previous projects, either using similar methods in other locations or expanding in a particular location. But each of our projects really builds upon another one. And in each case, we've used community engagement in different ways. Um, and we'll continue to do so. And we think it's a great way to give people in the community a feeling of ownership over the project, really an understanding of what's happening in the natural system here where they live, and have them feel a part of what's happening in their community and that they've helped to shape it. And so with that, I'll take questions.
Sorry, Susan, thank you so much. I was also having problems with my buttons here. Thank you so much. Most interesting and incredible experience in practical implementation of nature-based solutions. We have here several questions in the Q&A. And I'll start with the first one. Most of them at the beginning were about the flood modeling. One from James Harvey. Does the flood modeling shown for oyster take into account high tide, or is it modeled on an average tidal height?
That is a good question. It uses the SLAM model, which is the sea level affecting marshes model. And I'm not sure if I know that detail. I know that they modeled different storms, and what you're seeing is so for each grid point, you pick out the highest sea level from each storm. And so they had storms come over from different directions and also different intensities. And they would take again, the highest water level from each ensemble member for each storm intensity. I just don't remember whether the SLAM model had tides in it, but yeah, I think that's just a storm surge on top of what your tide level would be that's in those models.
Yeah.
And then the flood, the sea level rise portion of it, so just showing the average sea level height, we're actually using NOAA's sea level rise scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it does account for high tide,
Okay.
you know. It's yeah. So Sandra Fernandez has actually two questions. The sea level rise data used was from IPCC sixth assessment report.
So it's the NOAA sea level rise curves, which come from the National Climate Assessment in the US. And
Okay.
but NOAA does use the CMIP.
Yes.
CMIP simulation.
Is it the sixth
It's
or?
5. So we have not done any more of this modeling with CMIP 6.
Yeah, this is another aspect of you know of these issues that they need update, because while
Yes.
the science advances, you need to get the first coastal resilience tool and then the second updated with the new results, and that's also
Right. And to complicate it even more, the system here is so dynamic. The islands are changing constantly. The sediment in the coastal bays behind are changing constantly. And so we get LIDAR data, elevation data. I think it's on a 5 year cycle.
Mhm.
Um, and we have to incorporate that into the tool first, and then that would have to be updated in the models. And so it really is a process to keep these updated.
Yeah. Thank you. And then the last from Sandra, I would say, how did you apply the coastal vulnerability index?
So it was a marsh vulnerability index, not coastal vulnerability. And the marsh vulnerability index, if I'm understanding you correctly, is just looking at vulnerability to different erosional stressors. So whether it was from waves, the elevation of the marsh, the vegetation on the marsh, those kind of things.
Thank you. So, Tuzin Anosi, apologize for the pronunciation, is thanking you for the presentation. And is there a quantitative impact measurement to these risks? Flood, stormwater, sea level rise, and the attendant mitigating measures. I ask this because it helps inform decision in determining which NBS to adopt based on impact performance.
So a quantitative impact measurement from the nature-based solutions, do you think that's the question?
Yeah,
So in the tool, well, there is, so for example, the Living Shoreline tool takes into account um, different aspects of the system, and then it lets you know where a living shoreline might be effective, either just using marsh enhancement or marsh enhancement with structures, and where it's potentially not going to be effective. There might be too much energy in the system. The slope of the edge might be too steep, such that you can't do a living shoreline. Um, I would love to get more information into this tool. So, for example, the project in Wachapreg on the marsh, I'd like to get more information about which substrate does the best under different conditions and with different sediment types on the bottom, and understanding fetch. I think fetch is something that we don't have currently in the analysis in our tool, but I know that the South Carolina chapter has incorporated that into their Living Shoreline app. But there's certainly more information that we can learn from our projects here that we can then put into the tool to assess the effectiveness, to guide decisions about nature-based solutions.
thank you. So I have a question by Ira Yusuf. How do you gain the trust of your community? Where I come from, it's kind of natural for fisher folk and relatively disadvantaged coastal folks to be suspicious of governance, research interest. How do you provide reassurance?
So I think that's probably common in a lot of places, and it is the case here. I think that over the last 10 years or more, we've really made strides with our community, by having this advisory panel and by really actively using community members in our projects, having them involved from the beginning of the project, even out working on the projects themselves. I think that has helped to make a big difference here. But there's still a lot of communities that we don't reach. And it is something that we are still struggling with and working on, is how do we reach the folks that we don't know? How do we know, and so we're just doing our best to get representatives from the community to come to our events, and have open conversations. We have someone on our staff. We actually have someone that runs our education program, and we have someone who does our outreach coordination. And so we do have at least one dedicated staff member thinking about these activities. And we've done things like we had an intern the past 2 summers who was our Spanish language intern, because we have a lot of um, Spanish speaking folks here on the shore. And so we're trying to do things to reach out in those communities. I think that our education program also does a lot to help with that, because we bring kids in from our public schools. So it's a representation of the population here on the shore. And it has the, fisher folk kids and aquaculture, kids of people who do aquaculture and agriculture coming, and they come and they get to experience Brownsville Preserve and learn about their natural environment, and then go home and talk to their parents. Um, I think one of the more effective things too is that once they see what we're doing. So, if we can get people to come and be a part of our projects, and for example, in Oyster, we had some people who were skeptical and said, people have come before and said they were going to help us, and nothing ever came of it, you know. And so now that they see that we have created a plan and they have projects that are defined, whether or not they're on board with everything we say, they see that we really are trying to help. And so I think that goes a long way to building trust as well.
Thank you. So Ellen Williamson also asked, how did you get NBS through the environmental permitting and licensing? Was it hard, difficult?
I am not the right person to answer that question, because I I haven't experienced that. I do know that we have to get permits. We do own a lot of the Marsh Islands and Barrier Islands, and so that makes it more simple. However, the work that we did, like on the Marsh and Wachapreague, was owned by the state, and so we did have to go through and get permits for that. I do know that they can take a long time. Um, our folks who are doing the work on the ground are in touch with these agencies, and, we feel like we have strong partnerships with them, which I think helps. But I would agree with you that I think permitting is probably still sometimes a sticking point.
Yeah, there are several questions, and this is the last one because we need to close. But you have many questions, so you see the interest. And it's also very interesting for me by MJ Wilson. He's talking about how did you decide the overall mix to create your oyster substrate blocks, and use any recyclable material?
So the blocks themselves are made by someone else, and they do have a specific shape. They are a cement mixture that will break down in the water, and so they are, I guess you could call them environmentally friendly. But once the oysters attach to them and sort of solidify around them, then you'll just have the oysters. And then the substrate, the ones that looked like tables, that's actually it's copyrighted by a company called Sandbar, which is located in North Carolina. And they did show us how to make the substrate, but it is a design based off of their formula. And it's a jute material. It is going to break down into something that's not harmful, because it's a natural material, and then it's just soaked in cement that then hardens.
That's very interesting. And the time has come, unfortunately, because there are so many. Maybe we can send it to Susan and she can contact. Do we have I'm asking here, the real people that know how this whole thing works? Is it possible to send the emails to Susan for the people asking questions? No. I don't think so. Okay, so maybe the people now they know you and they can continue to ask you questions. And this is also why we invited you to make your work better known. Is really fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all later, maybe December 10.
Sounds great. And I'll welcome any questions if anyone wants to email me. That'd be great.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, all.